Feel the silk, not the coarse cotton of a working bandana. Silk. 12 inches of it, dyed deep red or black, or the specific blue that the trail hands of the 1870s favored, folded into a triangle and tied loose around the throat with the kind of knot that comes undone fast, when fast is what the next 30 seconds require. Cowboys called it the wild rag. And if you think it was fashion, if you think those men tied silk around their necks because it looked good against the dust and the dried blood and the 3 weeks of trail grime that covered everything else they wore, then you have been watching too many westerns and not enough history. The wild rag was a survival tool, possibly the most important one a trail hand carried that did not have a trigger. And in the summer of 1874, on a cattle drive, pushing 3,000 longhorns north through the Texas heat, it was the difference between a man who made it to Abilene and a man who did not. Here is what nobody tells you about the cattle drives. The heat, not the romantic, golden hour heat of a painted landscape, the actual heat. 108 degrees on the southern Texas plain in July, and that is the air temperature. The ground temperature, the baked caliche soil radiating upward at the feet and legs of a man on horseback, runs 20 degrees hotter. A trail hand on the Chisholm Trail in the summer months worked a 10, 12, 14-hour day in that heat. No shade, no water beyond what he carried and what the intermittent creeks provided. The cattle he was driving, 3,000 longhorns moving in a column a mile and a half long, generated their own heat, their own dust, their own specific contribution to the atmosphere that made the air around them a different thing than the air anywhere else on the southern plains. That air had to be breathed, that heat had to be managed. And the men who managed it best were the men who understood what the piece of silk around their neck was actually for. Silk does something that cotton cannot do at the same efficiency. It holds water against the skin and releases it slowly, evaporating across the surface in a continuous, controlled process that pulls heat from the body at the same rate the sun is attempting to add it. A cowboy who soaked his wild rag in creek water at the morning crossing and tied it back around his neck before the sun cleared, the ridge had, in effect, given himself a cooling system. Not a powerful one, not a comfortable one by any standard that a man in a cooled room in 2026 would recognize as comfort, but enough. Enough to keep the core temperature from climbing into the range where judgment fails and reflexes slow, and a man makes the kind of mistake that 3,000 nervous longhorns do not forgive. The cotton bandana did the same thing in principle, but cotton holds water in the weave. It gets heavy. It stays wet. It stops evaporating efficiently once it is saturated. Silk releases moisture from its surface continuously because the fiber structure does not trap it the same way. The silk stayed cooler longer, on a 14-hour day in 100-degree heat. Longer mattered in ways that are difficult to overstate. Pull the wild rag up over the nose and mouth. Simple. The motion of a man who has done it 10,000 times. One hand reaching up, the folded edge pulled from below the chin to the bridge of the nose, the eyes above it scanning the dust cloud rolling back from 3,000 pairs of hooves on dry Texas ground. That dust was not merely unpleasant. It was a specific, documented health hazard for men who breathed it day after day across 6 weeks of trail driving. The fine alkaline particles of the southern plains soil, the same particles that gave the caliche its pale color and its specific chemical aggression against skin and mucous membrane, worked into the lungs with the patient thoroughness of something that does not hurry because it has all the time it needs. Trail hands who drove cattle through the summer months without adequate face protection developed lung conditions that the frontier's medical practitioners documented with the resigned specificity of people observing a predictable outcome. The dust went in. The dust stayed. The wild rag filtered it. Not perfectly. Silk is not a medical-grade respiratory filter, and no one at the time was claiming it was. But enough. Enough to reduce the volume of fine particulate reaching the lungs through each breath. Enough to make the difference, across 6 weeks of driving, between a man who arrived in Abilene able to work the following season and a man who did not. During a stampede, the filtration function became urgent rather than preventive. A 3,000 animal stampede generated a dust cloud so dense that men riding in it reported losing visual contact with the ground beneath their horses. In those conditions, the wild rag was not a comfort measure. It was the instrument standing between a man's functioning lungs and what a stampede put into the air around him. He pulled it up. He rode into the dust. He did his work by sound and instinct and the specific trust that a man places in a horse that has been trained for exactly this, the back of the neck. That specific strip of skin between the hat brim and the collar of the shirt, the strip that the hat's shadow does not reach and the collar does not cover, is the most consistently sun-exposed surface on a man who spends 14 hours on horseback with his head tilted slightly down to watch the ground and the cattle ahead of him. After 6 weeks on the Chisholm Trail, that strip of skin did not merely burn. It cracked, it blistered, it opened. The alkaline dust worked into the openings. The specific infections that alkaline dust and open skin produce in combination are documented in the frontier medical literature with the same resigned specificity as the lung conditions. The wild rag, tied loose and folded down over the collar, covered that strip. The silk did not merely block the sun, it reflected it, the smooth surface sending the light away rather than absorbing it the way cotton does. On a man whose hat was worn forward and whose collar was turned up and whose wild rag was folded correctly across the back of the neck, the most vulnerable strip of skin was covered for the duration of the day. This was not comfort, it was maintenance. A trailhand who arrived in Abilene with his neck in working condition was a man who could be hired for the return drive or the following season. A man who arrived with open, infected skin from 6 weeks of unprotected exposure to the Texas sun was a man whose employer was looking for a replacement. The wild rag kept a man employable. That is a function worth silk. Charles Goodnight, the man who built the Goodnight-loving trail, one of the frontier's most documented and most respected cattlemen, wrote in his later years about what heat did to men on the trail with the specific honesty of someone describing a thing he had watched happen many times and had not been able to prevent every time. He wrote about men who stopped making decisions, not from cowardice, from heat. The specific cognitive failure that sustained exposure to extreme temperature produces in a body that has been asked to maintain its core temperature for 14 hours with inadequate water and inadequate shade. A failure that arrives not as collapse, but as a gradual, invisible degradation of judgment that the man experiencing it is usually the last to recognize. He wrote about men who fell from their horses and did not get up immediately, which in the vicinity of 3,000 cattle was a problem that the cattle did not wait for a solution to before proceeding. The men who lasted were the men who managed the heat actively, who soaked their wild rags at every water crossing, who kept the silk pulled up during the dust hours, who understood the specific geography of shade that the hat brim and the turned collar and the folded rag created around their heads and necks and used that geography deliberately. They were not comfortable. Comfort was not the proposition the Chisholm Trail extended to the men who worked it. The proposition was whether you made it to Abilene with the cattle and came back south for the next season. The wild rag was part of how the men who made it, made it. The wild rag did other things that the manuals never cataloged because nobody was writing manuals for cattle drives. Trail hands used it as a tourniquet on a bad cut when the distance to the nearest medical attention was measured in days. They used it as a sling for a broken arm when riding was still required regardless of the break. They used it to blindfold a spooked horse that needed to be walked through something the horse's eyes were telling it not to approach. They used it as a signal flag. The specific color combinations of different men's wild rags, visible from distances that a shout did not reach across a wide herd in open country. It was 12 inches of silk tied in a knot. It was the most versatile tool a trailhand carried that weighed nothing and cost almost nothing, and did more work per ounce than anything else in his outfit. The silk was not an accident. The cattlemen who first adopted the wild rag over the cotton bandana did not do it because silk was fashionable. They did it because the men who tried silk told the men who had not tried it what it did and what it did not do compared to cotton. And the comparison was not close, and the information moved through the working community of the cattle drives the way useful information always moves through communities of people doing difficult work. By word, by demonstration, by the specific testimony of a man who arrived at Abilene in better condition than he had arrived the previous season and could point to the change he had made. The actual wild rag was 12 inches of silk soaked in creek water at sunrise and worn wet against the throat for 14 hours in a 108-degree Texas summer. It was the dust filter pulled up over the nose and mouth when 3,000 animals stampeded through the dry caliche of the southern plains. It was the sun shield folded down over the back of a neck that would crack and blister and open without it. It was the tourniquet and the sling and the signal flag and the horse blindfold that together made it the most quietly essential piece of equipment on the entire Chisholm Trail. The men who wore it did not call it elegant. They called it necessary. And in the language of the cattle drive, where the only criterion that mattered was whether something worked well enough to justify the weight and the cost of carrying it across 1,000 miles of Texas heat, necessary was the highest compliment available. The wild rag earned it, every day, for 6 weeks at a stretch, in conditions that the word survival was invented to describe.